So thank you first and foremost for the invitation to speak here tonight, Simon and John. And as the title says, it's revisiting Dartmoor's wildlife, because I actually gave a presentation to this group back in 2014. But hopefully I'm going to provide you with some further insights and some new images. And as John says, Simon says, I'm going to focus a little bit more tonight on some ground nesting bird species and some of the work we're doing in relation to conservation on the moor. In terms of oh, not so good. There we go. I can't move the slide on. What's happening here? Okay, there we go. And so in terms of who I am and what I do, as Simon has said, basically I'm a scientist. I'm based at the University of Exeter, and my team sort of researches on a number of areas, and they all relate to the environment and sort of seeking to better develop knowledge for environmental protection. One of those is called ecotoxicology, and that basically is how the chemicals that we all use and put out into the environment and how they impact on sort of wildlife and wildlife systems. And my team sort of researches on everything from aquatic organisms to terrestrial organisms, from invertebrates right the way through to vertebrates. And a lot of what we do is trying to understand the way in which those chemicals cause those effects in wildlife. So we use a lot of so-called molecular tools, and we use a lot of imaging tools to help us pin down how and where those chemicals are working in the body. And the second sort of domain of research that we do is really focused around trying to develop more sustainable ways to produce food from a global perspective. Now, we produce a lot of our food from land, but arguably some of the more sustainable ways in terms of producing food are actually from water. So aquaculture, producing things like shrimp and mollusks and bivalves and things like finfish from aquaculture can actually provide really more sustainable ways in terms of producing the proteins and the lipids that we require to satiate the sort of the world's hunger. And here we're particularly focused on in Africa and Asia, looking at how we can enhance and improve productivity from pond systems, natural pond systems. And to do that, we look at the so-called microbiome, so the microbial assemblages in ponds, using molecular tools to help us better understand how we can enhance that productivity, but also to buffer against diseases. Diseases are the biggest problem in relation to growth and the intensification of aquaculture. And the last sort of area that our team works on really is much more germane to tonight's presentation, and it's really about trying to use some of those molecular tools that I mentioned to help us better understand what organisms require from the landscape. So what do birds, migrant birds, require from the landscape in terms of when they come back to the UK to breed. So we use molecular tools, and I'll talk a little bit about this later on in terms of trying to better understand what they feed on, so what resources they require, and so therefore we can better protect those resources to enable and better protect those bird species. And we also use some of these molecular tools to help us better understand the impact of invasive species. And so Asian hornets, the image is actually of European hornets here, but we work on Asian hornets, which are species which are now coming to our shores, and they're starting to feed on things like honeybees. They're quite destructive of honeybee colonies, but also they feed on all sorts of other invertebrates which provide us with pollination services. So we can use a lot of those molecular tools I mentioned earlier in some of our other work to actually apply to address sort of conservation sort of issues. So the team really, where I come from really in terms of what my drive is in terms of the workplace, is really trying to develop better understanding in relation to how organisms work and how they fit into the environment and how we impact on them, so we can better start to move to better conserve and protect them. But I'm sure like many people sitting on the call here tonight, my passion is natural history. It's wildlife biology, and I enjoy wildlife photography too. And I've been incredibly lucky, I suppose, really, I've been able to travel to actually all the world's continents in search of weird and wonderful wildlife, from the freezer zones of the Arctic to the Antarctic to the tropical zones in places like Africa, of course, with fantastic assemblage of huge biomass across the African plains. I often think some of the more interesting wildlife in places like Africa are overlooked. One of my favorite mammals in Africa is the elephant shrew, a fantastic little small mammal basically. And of course, there's some fantastic exotic bird life to be seen there too. One of the most spectacular things I think I've ever seen is the emergence of hundreds, if not 1,000, of carmine beaters flying across the Zambezi River first thing in the morning. So regions across them, like in Borneo, some of the wonderful rainforests, incredibly rich in terms of its biodiversity, particularly in relation to the invertebrates, the insects that you can find there, things like Chinese lantern bugs, through these wonderful huge Malayan tarantulas, and of course things like the bird life and the apes too. Across the wetlands, the Pantanal in places like Brazil, Brazil, with this huge open expansive wetlands, again with its fantastic assemblage of wildlife, which is aquatic or semi-aquatic, and through, of course, to wonderful things like sunbitters, through the toucans, giant river otters, and of course to pretty incredible things like the jaguars. And I've had a couple of close encounters with jaguars out on those sort of trips and trails too. And last but not least, in terms of sort of some of the overseas sort of travels, you know, somewhere like Australia, which is quite incredible. It's an island, of course, and so a lot of the organisms there are some are in what we term evolutionary bottlenecks. And so we have things like, you know, the marsupials, things like the possums and the paddy melons pictured here, and things like kangaroos. And then, of course, you know, mammals that lay eggs, the so-called monotrines. I mean, some incredibly wonderfully diverse organisms there too. But I'm as happy here in Devon as I am anywhere in terms of my travel. I was actually born in Devon, in North Devon, and I returned here about 22 years ago. I live now in South Devon on the edge of Dartmoor. We still have some pretty fantastic wildlife. In fact, Devon is the second most diverse county in all of England, basically. So we have some pretty wonderful wildlife on our doorstep, which we can go out and view and explore and investigate. And actually, sadly, though, I would say that in terms that, although we have some of the best biodiversity monitoring schemes anywhere in the world, we're probably not the best in terms of protecting that biodiversity. And so Dartmoor really is my playground, or is my wildlife playground. I'm sure it's the same for many of you. I live on the edge of Dartmoor, and when I get the opportunity and chance, it's getting out to the open spaces to try and experience some of the fantastic wildlife that we can see up there. And Dartmoor really is still very much a special place for wildlife. And in part, it's got this fantastic wildlife because the mosaic of habitats that it offers, essentially. Clearly, it's a large national park, about 954 square kilometres. I think it was actually the first national park established in England. And it extends from sea level up to about 600 metres at places like Will Hayes. And as I say, it's this mosaic of habitats that provides this great richness and diversity of wildlife. So we have moorland, we have farmland, we have woodland, we have a whole series of reservoirs and rivers that run off the moor. About 30% of the national park is actually in SSI status. So a great place to explore and find some wonderful wildlife. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to go through a couple of sort of the environments, the habitats, and just illustrate just a little bit of the wildlife that we can find there. Time is pretty short tonight, so I'm going to largely focus subsequently open moor, because that's really where some of our scientific studies have been ongoing for the last sort of decade, 12 years or so. So woodlands, first and foremost, about 11% of Dartmoor is covered in woodlands, and some of the fantastic woodlands, of course, are these western oaks in places like Blackator Copse and things like Wistman's Wood, a number of a fantastic little enclave, basically, where you can find these western oaks. The best time actually to go and see, I think, these woodlands are March, April time, before the oak leaves start to come out, because we get these sort of verdant, these rich plethora of polypody ferns and epiphytes, lichens and mosses that carpet the sort of the stones that sit beneath these, you know, these fantastic ancient woodlands. And they harbour a fantastic variety of invertebrates. Don't have time to go and log them tonight. I would love to do so, but one special one, and I'm sure many of you people are familiar with John Walters, my good friend John Walters, and one of his specialist subjects, if you like, is the study of the blue ground beetle. It's a specialist of these types of wet oak woodlands. We find them in sort of places in around Dartmoor and other parts of Devon too, and into places like Wales. And especially adapted, they're actually an arboreal beetle. They live a lot of the time up in the canopy in the trees, hunting slugs, and they're especially adapted mandibles to feed on slugs. And these long extended mandibles mean they can hold the slug out at distance and not get all the mouthparts too caked up with all the mucus that these slugs produce as they're eating them. And there's all sorts, of course, of other wonderful invertebrates that we can find in these woodlands, especially when we come to spring and summer, not least things like the white admirals, through to some fantastic fritillaries, of course, things like silverwash fritillary. But focusing a little bit on the birds that we can find in some of these woodlands, in the wet woodlands, in the sort of the willow woodlands, which again are a threatened habitat here in the UK. So again, Dartmoor's really important in terms of its wet woodlands. We can find this little chap here, somber little bird, basically a dull little coloured bird, one might say, but a fantastic little bird nonetheless. This is the willow tit. It's quite similar to the marsh tit. I'm sure many people are familiar with the marsh tit. It comes to your nut feeder, I'm sure, in your garden. But the willow tit's a little bit different. It has this more diffuse sort of black chin. The marsh tit has a very clean sort of black chin. It has a dull black cap. whereas the marsh tit has a sort of shiny black cap, and it also has sort of a pale coverts on the secondaries. But those are quite difficult field diagnostics. The best field diagnostic, I think, actually, in terms of its morphology, is the marsh tit has a white little spot at the base of the bill. The key way of actually telling them apart, to be honest with you, is really the call. They're very different in terms of their calls. But these wet woodlands that we have on Dartmoor are really important for this massively declining bird species. Another really important bird species that we have out on the moor is a lesser spotted woodpecker, diminutive little woodpecker, much smaller than the great spotted woodpecker. The male on the left has this nice little red cap, and the female doesn't have that red cap. They love to nest in actually birch areas, so often in trees which are rotting. And in fact, sometimes the trees are so rotting you can almost push them over. So they're quite precarious in terms of where they nest. And this is threatened, or certainly in massive decline in the UK. And again, Dartmoor is a really important refuge. This is a sad little story actually for this particular nest, because this was found by a friend of mine last year, and I went and watched it a few mornings. And one morning I was watching the parents coming back, feeding the chicks, and they were feeding things like the green caterpillars we can see on the right, and also all sorts of different aphids as well. They particularly feed on aphids actually during the breeding season. And I saw this sort of brown blur go up the tree. Then suddenly I saw this little thing appear from the nest hole, a stoat basically. And a stoat has been in and predated these lesser spotted woodpecker chicks. So it just chewed, it took one out, and then it came back a minute later and took the other out. Really quite sad. And you can imagine these are tiny little birds. The size of that nest hole is about an inch and a quarter. So these stoats can really steel can squeeze in these tiny little spaces. So quite a sad demise for a wonderful bird. These oak woodlands that we have up on Dartmoor are hugely important for a number of migrant birds, and the three which I call a quintessential trio. The first of those is a pied flycatcher. Sounds a bit like a creaking gate if you're walking through somewhere like White Wood or somewhere like Yarner Wood, something like a creaking gate. That's going to be the pied flycatcher. They'll be back in a month or so's time, and they're doing rather well. It's kind of nice to extol the virtues of certain schemes, because many of our birds are in decline, of course, but the nest box schemes that have been implemented really since the sort of late 50s and the 60s has really helped to increase the population of pied flycatchers, and they're doing very well on the moor. The second of the quintessential trio, this wonderful thing, this is the red start, of course. This is the male, fantastic orange, verdant colours, is nice little snow forefront to the head, and it has this bright yellow gape. The male, of course, is the highly coloured one. And actually, if you see them when they come back, when they're just coming back on their breeding territory, it's worth standing around and watching them, because they do a fantastic display in and around their nest hole when they're attracting a female. They'll actually fan their wings and fan their tail and almost do a display a bit like a bird of paradise. I've only ever seen it 3 or 4 times, never been able to capture it on film, but it's a fantastic thing to see. Then the third in the sort of trio is my favourite. I have the trio, this is Phyloscopus sibilitrax, and which translated means whistling leaf lover, and that epitomizes and describes it beautifully. It lives up in the upper canopy basically, and it sings its wonderful descending song. And when the male's singing that descending song, it puts all its energy and effort in. The whole body sort of reverberates, vibrates as it's making that sort of wonderful call. It's only the female that builds a nest. There she is in the bottom left end of the picture, and they nest on the ground. When we look in terms of stats and in relation to some of our woodland birds for which Dartmoor provides a refuge, not least things like the wood warbler and lesser spotted woodpecker, we can see that some of the species really are in decline, and in precipitous decline, a really worrying decline. So the wood warbler is down about 70%, and lesser spotted woodpecker is down by about 80%. So again, just emphasising how important some of these environments, these habitats, are on Dartmoor for protection of some of our really precious species. Now, this little chap here, this bigger chap here, you might not be quite so popular as a bird species, but the jay, of course, remember the crow family, the corvid, it does indeed predate on smaller birds and on the eggs and nestlings of other birds. But actually, it's really important also in terms of the ecology of the system, in the sense that it plants many acorns to produce a whole series of other oak woodlands, anywhere between 5 up to 8,000 acorns each in the birds might cache each sort of autumn and winter time. And unlike the grey squirrel, which does a similar thing but bites out the germ element of the acorn, the jay doesn't. So many of those acorns that it caches away will turn into new oak trees. And then if you're lucky enough and you know in the, some on the edges and the verges of some of these woodlands where some of the long-tailed tits will actually roost during the winter time, this is a fantastic sight to see. And here we have a group of maybe 10 or 11 long-tailed tits basically, and these are family or sub or sib groups basically, and they come together and roost in these at certain sites during the winter time to obviously to keep warm during the night time. And they have this fantastic interaction as they come to roost. Often it's the dominant individuals that hang around until late, and then they'll plonk themselves just right in the middle of that roost in the warmest spot. And you can see some wonderful things like this in some of our woodlands upon to another environment, another habitat. If you move on to sort of the watery regions of Dartmoor, of course, there's plenty of water on Dartmoor, to say the very least. It rains just about every month of the year. In fact, most days I'm up on Dartmoor, we see some sort of rain. And the water reserves that they're coming to all sorts of environments. They come in still waters, big expanses like Burrator and Benford, and smaller ponds, and then of course we have running waters too. On the still waters, we see again a wonderful assemblage of different types of wildlife, including things like some great array of different dragonflies and mayflies. We have some rare species like the southern damselfly, and we have some commoner species like this southern hawkers. Incredible life cycles. Most of their life, of course, is spent below water as a nymph, as we see in the left-hand side. In fact, in some cases, things like some of the golden ring dragonflies, for example, which you find up on, they can be 5 or sometimes even 6 years as a nymph, and then they're on the ring just for a few weeks during late spring and or summertime. They're voracious predators when they're a nymph, and they're a voracious predator when they're an adult winged form as well. They have incredible visual acuity. Each one of those compound eyes is composed of 28,000 facets, each one with a lens behind it, and they have this fantastic flicker vision. And they have these other little receptors on top of their head called ocelli, which perceive light, and they're connected directly to the wing flight muscles, basically, and help in terms of orientation. So incredible feats of engineering. What amazes me up on the moor, really, certainly in terms of when the amphibians emerge to breed, when the frogs first come out to breed on the moor, it's incredibly cold. They breed actually in January, which is earlier than we see in some of the regions off the moor. Often they're breeding in February, sort of March time. So they're probably somewhat different in terms of their genetics, but they haul themselves out to breed in the ponds and in the lakes in January, sort of mid to late January. And of course, the name of the common frog, Rana temporaria. Temporara means temporary pond. So many of the spawn you see are on these small ephemeral ponds. And then shortly after, maybe 3-4 weeks after the frogs, we see the toads coming out to spawn. With all that wonderful food around, of course, we get predators in these pond systems. And the largest snake that we get in the UK, we can find on Dartmoor, the grass snake. You can grow up to about 4 foot in length. And it's a particularly aquatic of all of the snake species, and feeds particularly on things like fish and amphibians, including like this poor little newt. So those are the standing waters. If we look at some of the flowing waters, some of the rivers and streams that flow off Dartmoor, there are 18 rivers that flow off Dartmoor, the Dart, the Tean, the Erm, the Bovey, just to name a few. And these are just wonderful places to be and immerse yourself. Walks along the rivers and streams at any time of the year. You can have this wonderful spectacle of whether it's snow-clad or whether it's iced up, and or when we get this wonderful verdant emergence of all the ferns that decorate these streams that cascade down from the moor through to the autumn time. Of course, when we got the wonderful rowans starting to change colour, and just a few places on the moor where you can go, you can get some beech trees lining some of the sides of the rivers and streams that cascade down off the moor. Beautiful, beautiful scenics out on the moor. Lovely place to be. Alongside these waters that cascade down from the moors, of course, we get aquatic and semi-aquatic bird species. We get things like the grey wagtail, which now actually is on the orange list. It's on the amber list. It's unfortunately again in decline in the UK. And we get the dipper. And the dipper already up on the moor is breeding. It's already constructed its dome nests, particularly likes to nest in around bridges and or waterfalls. And many of them already got eggs up on the moor now. It's an early breeding bird. Other birds we can see out on the rivers, we can see things like the goosander. Here's a female goosander with some of the ducklings sitting on the back. These nest up in trees, sometimes 30-40 feet up in trees. And as soon as those ducklings hatch, 24 hours old, something like that, they fall out or jump out that nest hole. And they're sort of very rubbery in nature, in a sense that when they bounce on the ground, they don't seem to harm themselves, even from that sort of height, that sort of distance. And then the first sort of few weeks they'll spend on the river before they then go down more towards the sort of the estuary sort of regions. And quite often when they're very young like this, you can see them riding on mum's back. And then exotics, we get some exotics now, which are very much resident species on these waterways that cascade down off the moor. Things like the mandarin duck, of course, originates from the Far East, places like China. But it's now a resident species up on the moor and breeds up on the moor. Similar sort of lifestyle in terms of the goosander. It breeds up in holes in the tops of trees as well. And then we have our homegrown exotic, if you like. On the lower reaches of the moor, we'll see things like this wonderful kingfisher. And you can never see too many kingfishers. So my heart always misses a beat, or races indeed, every time I see a kingfisher. Beautiful, beautiful birds. So moving now to the sort of main event to some extent, I suppose, really, in terms of the habitat, I'm going to focus on most of the rest of my talk tonight, and that's the open moor and sort of heathlands on the moor. And they range, of course, from the sort of the higher peaks around the Tors, the picture top right of the Tavy Valley, through into sort of more the open reaches in around sort of the Venford Reservoir. And some of these environments haven't changed for many years, thousands of years. And we know that because if you take things like cores from some of these regions and you look at the pollen back over time, so each plant will produce a pollen of a particular size and structure, basically, you can look back over time and see actually in terms of the environment hasn't changed hugely for thousands of years. Now, the open moor is really quite a harsh place for wildlife during the winter, and I'm sure many of you, when you go up on your ventures walking across the moor, don't tend to see too much wildlife during the winter period because it's a pretty harsh and tough environment. Of course, when the snow falls, you get these wonderful scenics, but that's tough for wildlife. We get a few of our resident birds which eke an existence out upon the moor, and some of them actually the resident ones who are a bit of so-called vertical migration or vertical movement. So they'll be up on the open moor when it's a nice day, and then they'll drop down off the moor when it's a bit of a harsher or crueler day. And one of those birds, of course, includes the wonderful resident stonechat. If you're lucky, you might come across this when you're walking out across from the open moor. This is a jack snipe. This, unlike the snipe, its cousin, which is slightly bigger in size, this bird will sit very, very tight indeed. Sometimes you can always step on them before they take a light. And then, of course, every now and again we get the light coming in. It's interesting in terms of we tend to get these sort of episodic fluxes of great grey shrikes in the wintertime. So they come here and they overwinter on places like Dartmoor. Sometimes we can have 2 or 3 on the moor. This year, I don't think there's been any. And it's been very interesting in terms of UK generally. There's been very few great grey shrikes in the country sort of this winter. And this one, I think Simon was mentioning Emsworthy earlier. This bird was actually at Emsworthy a few years ago. And then again, if you're lucky, if you're up on the moor, every now and again, you might see a few other birds passing through during the winter time, things like short-eared owls. And they don't tend to stay long though, because as I say, the food sources up there are pretty meager during the winter time. As we move from the winter time into sort of like springtime and into the summer, of course, we start to get this explosion of life upon the moor. It really excites me, I have to say, once all the birds start to return, in terms of sort of the migrant birds are starting to return, we're starting to the moor really come into its full color, its full flavor. And even up on these higher reaches of the moor, which tend to be fairly nutrient poor and tough environment which exists, we found some great plant species, things like some of the sundews. This is the oval leaf sundew. You get this is a round leaf sundew. You get the oval leaf sundew too. And of course, because it's nutrient poor up there, they tend to trap insects in those little shiny dew drops that you can see, basically. So they actually catch those insects, and then they digest those insects, and that gives them that extra nutrients, enabling them to live and exist in those environments. Really important that these sort of blanket bogs, it's quite a rare habitat nowadays, and they provide environments for a whole variety of other sort of specialist organisms, really, including some of the invertebrates. And one of my favorites is this guy, and apologies for any arachnophobes out there, but this is a fantastic spider. It's one of the biggest spiders. It is the biggest spider in the UK. This is Dolmedes, basically, the raft spider, and it feeds on all sorts of things, anything from terrestrial inverts right way through to aquatic vertebrates. It'll even feed on things like tadpoles, for example, in some environments on small fish, things like sticklebacks too. I do like that central bottom image. Although it looks like it's a pollution, actually that's typical for the higher reaches of Dartmoor. That's actually some oil exudates that come out from the peaty bogs up on the moor. And I think actually that increase in terms of oil in the water helps create a greater surface tension. So it's easy for these big spiders to float around on those ponds, on those watery areas. In these higher reaches of the moor now, so literally in the next sort of couple of weeks, we'll start to see a few of the migrants returning. One of my favorites is the wheatear, of course, and white arse, the Norse name or the Old English name. Actually, wheatear means white arse, and that's pretty apt in terms of describing this bird species, because one of the first things you notice is it's flipping around and flying around, picking flying away from you, is it has this bright white rump, whether it's the male in this case or indeed the female. And then not long after that, we get this wonderful bird returning. This is definitely, without question, one of my favorite birds of them all. This is the ring ouzel. It's a member of the Turdidae. It's a member of the thrush family. It looks just like a blackbird, of course, the male does, but it has this wonderful white courgette. The female is brown in color, and as she matures, she changes color. She gets darker. So some of the young females can be very bronzy in color, and as the females get older, they go quite dark. In fact, some of the mature females can look very similar to the males as well. And these really are a bird of the upper moor. There's nothing more wonderful than actually walking somewhere like the Tavy Valley very early in the morning, on a misty morning or a wet morning, and hearing this sort of melancholic call of the ring ouzel as it sings out across the valley. Often, of course, this time of year, it's pretty wet and miserable, and these birds are used to these tough environments. This is quite a sad story, I have to say, in relation to ring ouzels. It's been a massive demise in terms of their population on the moor. Since I've been back 20 years, 22 years, basically, they've gone down from about 20 pairs, 25 pairs breeding on the moor to last year, only one pair was recorded breeding on the moor. So only one pair was known to be breeding on the moor last year. So it looks like we're going to lose this as a breeding species on Dartmoor. Other birds which are really special is upper reaches of the mooring, some waders that breed there, things like the snipe. There's about 200 pairs or so of snipe that breed on the moor. And this chap here, this is the dunlin, of course, and this is the most southerly breeding population of dunlin in the UK. And they produce these wonderful little nests with these fantastic eggs, huge eggs relative to the biomass of the body mass of the bird. About a third of the body weight the female goes in producing these wonderful eggs, these lovely sort of olive coloured eggs with these sort of brown markings on them. As we move down a little bit from that higher moor into the more sort of heathy areas, especially as we move from spring into summer, now we start to see they're all sort of bonanza, I would say, in terms of provision of resources for insect life and therefore bird life. So as the gorse, the 2 species of gorse and the 4 species of heather start to bloom, they provide this wonderful assemblage of pollen, so protein, and nectar to feed a whole variety of invertebrate species. And one of the fantastic things, butterflies you can find up, this tiny little diminutive butterfly. This is the green hair streak. It's about the size of your thumbnail. The Latin name is Clothrus rubri, which means hairy eyebrow, and that's because the palps, if you look around the mouth of this little butterfly, are sort of like, look very much like an eyebrow. The image on the top left shows its caterpillar, shows its larva, and these have a fascinating life cycle, fascinating ecology, intricately linked with ants. So once the larva is about to pupate, it goes down to the ground, it gets carried underground by ants, and the ants look after it as it pupates, basically, and then they protect that pupa from parasitic wasps. Parasitic wasps kill lots of other invertebrates. So these ants are actually protecting this little chrysalis, this pupa, basically, as it goes through the metamorphosis into a butterfly. And in return, that pupa actually provides a little sugary secretion to those ants. And actually, it's quite incredible. If you actually pick up a small pupa, it squeaks. So it actually communicates with that ant colony as well. So incredible little life cycle. This is all happening on the doorstep up on Dartmoor. And there are a number of blue butterfly species that show similar sort of interrelationships with ants. But the most spectacular, probably, of the Lepidoptera, of the butterflies and moths on the moor, is this chap here. Then this is the Saturnia pavonia. This is the emperor moth, of course. Here's a female, the top left. She's this big grey bodied female with lovely sort of pink markings, large bodied females, and she sits out on the vegetation usually about April, early May time, and she sort of pumps out pheromones to attract a male. Male showing in the bottom right, somewhat more brightly coloured, and they have the greatest sense of olfaction of any known invertebrate on the globe, on the planet, basically. So again, this is all happening on Dartmoor. It's the only member of our silk moth family that are found in the UK. And so as these females pumping out these pheromones, you can see these males flying from great distances away, picking up just 1 or 2 molecules of that pheromone towards the female to mate with her. And then, of course, once they produce the eggs and then the larvae, when they first come out, are pretty boring, they're pretty dark in color, but then they create these wonderful, as they undergo sort of transition, they go this wonderful green caterpillar, this large caterpillar, which is a really important food stuff to one of my favorite birds, which I'll talk about in a minute. Other species we can find out up in the open moor, if you move up the phyla, if you like, now moving into the vertebrates, you find adders, of course. That's the second species of snake that we can find on the moor. And the males, they come in all different sort of colors and sizes, actually. The males always have a dark black zigzag going down the back, and females always have a brown. So females tend to be much more varied in terms of their color. They're so-called ground colors, so they can be olive, they can be golden color, they can be sort of russet, they can be all sorts of colors, but they always have that brown zigzag down the back, and the males always have the black zigzag down the back. Males change a lot just before they mate, and so they undergo shedding, so it's so-called slough their skin. And so when the males are sloughed, they change from that brown ground color to this sort of grayish color with lovely sort of olive and sort of gold flecks through it. And every now and again, if you're really lucky, and I've just seen maybe 3 or 4 in my whole time back here in Devon up on the moor, you can find the sort of the melanistic form, the black morph. And actually it's not black, it's a lovely cobalt blue. So if you catch it in the right light, you can see this wonderful iridescent blue that transpires from this fantastic creature. And it's probably black, basically, this melanistic form, to help it absorb heat. So these open moor areas are really important now as we move spring into summer as breeding grounds for a whole variety of our resident birds. And I use that term quite carefully or conservatively because, of course, they're not resident to the moor. They move back to the moor from lower reaches at this time of year to breed. And so we have things like the yellowhammer, the stonechat, the linnets, the siskins, the reed bunting, the redpoll, that little bird that gives that little machine gun call, and things like skylarks too. So this whole array of birds comes back to the open moor to breed on the moor. And not only do we have these so-called resident or UK species, we have a whole assemblage of migrant birds which are coming all the way back from southern Europe and Africa to breed on the moor too. Things like tree pipits and meadow pipits, the chiffchaff, willow warblers, and things like the grasshopper warbler and the wonderful windchat too. And it's quite incredible when you look, there's about 5 billion birds come back from Africa to Eurasia to breed. And that shows you how important international bird conservation is. We need to be protecting the birds in Africa as much as we are in the UK if we want to protect some of these fantastic migrants that come back to Dartmoor to breed. I have lots of favorites, and I know I keep saying this is my favorite. Another favorite of mine is quite a somber bird, basically, but it's the grasshopper warbler. It has this wonderful reeling call, a bit like a grasshopper, and actually it's quite a furtive little, it flies all the way back from southern Europe and Africa to breed on Dartmoor. And it's quite a furtive little bird. It's just up, tends to be up early in the morning, the males, giving that grasshopper reel just when it's setting up its territory, so maybe for a week, a couple of weeks, no more than that, and then it's incredibly quiet and furtive little bird and quite hard to spot. It'll pop up again maybe in June time if it has a second brood. For the most part, it's quite a difficult little bird to see. And then we've got old Scratchy as well, this wonderful Dartford warbler. And there's just a few places on the moor where this bird also continues to breed on the open moor. It's a bird actually that suffers a lot in terms of cold winters. It really can't tolerate cold winters. And so when we get those really cold winters, prolonged cold winters, we see these populations decline quite drastically. And of course, all of these birds, whether the resident or the migrant birds, come back to the moor to breed. And that's because there's the right habitat from there to produce the nest, and clearly that there's sufficient resources, food reserves for them to bring up their offspring. So they're making these huge perilous journeys back from southern Europe and Africa with high risk, basically, because of what the moor offers in terms of a breeding site for them. And they come in this wonderful assemblage. Often when you find a nest, actually you can tell what the species is just in terms of how the nest has been constructed and what that nest material is made of. And certainly if it's got eggs in it, becomes very easy and very sort of diagnostic. And so for example, when you look across the different species, this lovely little blue ones here, these are windchat, these are skylark chicks, actually very well cryptically camouflaged in the nest. These are the windchat here. Here we have the meadow pipit, here we have linnets, and these wonderful sort of chocolatey swirl ones, that's the reed bunting. So they're all very, very different, all have these diagnostic signatures in terms of what species they are, what they represent. But I would say in terms of all the nests that you could find up on the moor, one of the most beautiful, I think, and beautifully constructed is a common bird. It's the chaffinch. It's made of mosses and lichens, and it's threaded together beautifully, and it's lined often with horsehair. The ponies, the Dartmoor ponies, provide that hair to line the nest, and often with lots of feathers as well. The beautifully coloured eggs with the sort of light bluish eggs with these wonderful sort of russet marks. But I think top prize in relation to nest construction goes to this little chap here. We mentioned him before, the long-tailed tits, and This produces a nest, and really intricate nest. And if you're out actually in the field now, there are lots of nests already constructed. I found 3 or 4 last weekend, and they're made of moss and lichen, and it knits that moss together. It's a dome-shaped nest with spider's web, basically. Now, spider's web isn't made of one material. Often, many spiders can use 8 different types of spider thread, all with different types of ductility and strength, basically. And they intricately use this spider's web material, basically, to knit this nest together. And the reason for doing that is it gives it great flexibility as well as strength. And so often the long-tailed tit will produce 6, 8, even 10 offspring. So as those offspring grow, the nest actually stretches. And so it's a clever little bird, to say the very, very least. And it's addicted to feathers. So once it's made that nest, it will put hundreds, if not thousands of feathers into that nest. Beautiful, beautiful little construction. It spends almost as much time making the nest as it does actually producing the offspring and raising the offspring. And some of the birds don't actually use any nest at all. And if you're lucky enough to come across this, no nest at all, these wonderful white eggs with these sort of like grey and sort of like golden marks on the eggs. This is this little chap here, fantastic nightjar, of course, which has come all the way back from Africa. Wonderfully cryptic, hard to spot, that's for sure, once they're on the ground. And when the eggs hatch, this is what they look like. Of course, they're nocturnal birds feeding on nocturnal flying aerial insects, basically. And they have these big sweet net mouths. You can see this little chap here on the left has already got that sweet net sort of mouth, and the bottom right is showing a parent with 2 chicks which are close to fledging. And you can never see too many nightjars. This nightjar's actually got it got 2 chicks here. One's facing towards you, and you can just see the bum, just see the back end of the other, which is facing away. Wonderfully, wonderfully cryptic. And it's quite incredible because almost as soon as they leave the nest, the nightjars know that they have to mimic sticks and logs, basically. And this one actually was out the nest probably about 2 days, no more than that, and already it was doing a pretty good job in terms of mimicking a log. But the bird, and I'm a little bit biased, the bird of them all, in my humble opinion, is the cuckoo. To my mind, this has the most fantastic and interesting ecology of any bird that we have in the UK. And I hope I convince you of that in the next few slides. So I'm sure everyone knows what a cuckoo does. It lays its eggs in other birds' nests, so it gets other birds to bring its offspring up. Many years ago, there were many races, different races in the UK that parasitized things like meadowpipits, pied wagtails, robins, dunnocks, and things like reed warblers. And a cuckoo, any one female cuckoo, could only produce one type of egg, so mimic one type of a bird egg. We've lost, for the most part, the mimics of things like the robin and the pied wagtail. We still have reasonable numbers in parts of England and certainly in Scotland for the meadowpipit race or gentii and the reed warbler as well. The one on Dartmoor parasitizes the meadowpipits. And so you can see a nest top left of the cuckoo egg, which has been laid in this meadowpipit nest, and it mimics it rather well in terms of color and morph. Actually, if you look under the UV spectrum, UV light, and birds see into UV light, it's even more perfect in terms of the color matching of that egg to the meadowpipit eggs. It's slightly bigger, about 10% bigger than those meadowpipit eggs, and that's because when that cuckoo hatches, next image just going on, it has to push those eggs. Well, it pushes those eggs, or indeed, if a chick has hatched, if a meadowpipit chick has hatched, it'll push all of those out the nest. And so then it's clearly going to take all the food from its surrogate parents. Now, an incredible thing in terms of an adaptation, in terms of enables, for the most part, the cuckoo to hatch before those meadowpipits, is that when the meadowpipit lays its eggs, it doesn't actually incubate the eggs until it's laid all of its eggs. And the female cuckoo is watching those pipits in terms of in her territory, because she commands the territory, males just moving in and out. And when the meadowpipit's laid the last egg, it will go in, it will take one of the eggs and lay its own eggs. But what it's done, it's already had that egg held inside the body of that female for 24 hours, sometimes 48 hours. And so the incubation period for when that egg is, the cuckoo egg is in the nest, in the meadowpipit nest, is only 11 days. Whereas in the case of the meadowpipits, it's 12 or 13 days. And so often, for the most part, it tends to be the cuckoo chick hatches first. Anyway, the poor old meadowpipits are all pushed out of the nest. And so what you see is this sort of alien bird sitting in a nest just after a week, or this individual is about 8 or 9 days old. And it's incredible how the meadow pipit doesn't recognize it as its own. It nurtures it and brings it up as if it is its own chick. And that really contrasts with when the cuckoos first arrive back. And they first arrive back on Dartmoor. The earliest I've seen them is the 9th of April, but normally it's towards the mid to the end of April. And as soon as the cuckoos come back and they sit on their song post, they're bombarded by meadow pipits. Meadow pipits know their bad news. That image on the right-hand side is actually showing a meadow pipit pulling feathers out of a cuckoo which was sitting on its song post. This is quite I was really pleased to get this image a couple of years back. There's a cuckoo on a song post and the meadow pipits were bombarding it. And this cuckoo actually managed to catch that meadow pipit for a short period of time. You can just see it holding it by its leg, but luckily the meadow pipit got away. But despite the fact that they recognize them as being problematic when they first arrive, once they've got a cuckoo chick in the nest, they nurture it carefully, they bring it all the way through, and not only when it through to fledgling, they then look after it as a fledgling. So sometimes I've seen them following the cuckoo, the young cuckoo, for up to 3 weeks after it's left the nest. And so you can imagine these poor meadow pipits are pretty knackered at the end of it all, because they have to put so much energy and effort and resource into bringing up these cuckoos. This was a rather nice one. This is a young cuckoo. This was 1 year when I was watching one of the nests with a friend, John Walters, and we watched it between us most days, I think. And this was a period where it was incredibly dry. We had no rain for about 3 or 4 weeks, and this bird had been out in the nest maybe 4 or 5 days, 5 or 6 days, and it was the first rain, and so it was the first shower this bird got, and it's obviously very much enjoying its first shower. And by watching birds, and I'm sure many people sitting on this call do the same thing, by watching birds over time, you start to learn and see, you know, lots of new things, I suppose, really. This is something that was very new to me over the last couple of years, actually seeing cuckoos actually displaying to females, picking up things like what one might perceive as nesting material, breaking things like twigs off, even picking up things like pony dung, basically, and displaying it to the female. And I don't know whether that's a ritual in terms of it trying to attract the female, or whether it harks back to perhaps, you know, back in millennia, basically, but perhaps when they produced their own nests. Now, if a female cuckoo can't find a meadow pipit nest, sometimes they'll do something called egg dumping, and I don't think that's a great term for it, but essentially they'll put an egg in another bird's nest. And here is a cuckoo, it's actually put a meadow pipit race cuckoo has put a cuckoo egg into a windchat nest, and you clearly see it doesn't match at all. And windchats are very, very bright or very perceptive, and they're very rarely predated by cuckoos or parasitized by cuckoos. And this bird almost immediately deserted the nest. She wasn't going to bring it up. But I have seen it just once. A friend of mine who actually, this was on Exmoor, we think actually that the windchat, the cuckoo actually laid her egg in this windchat nest very late in the day, basically. So probably when the windchat was well into incubation. And so actually the windchat continued to incubate this cuckoo egg, and of course then the cuckoo chick. And quite sadly, though, when I was watching it, watching the female windchat sitting on top of a bush just after she had fed this young cuckoo. This is just after it's fledged here, and a sparrowhawk took it. And so, in fact, it was this poor male windchat had to do all the work itself, actually bringing that cuckoo through. But it did so, and it got it through to fledging, and that bird certainly migrated. I don't know how far it got, but it certainly got away from Exmoor. So that's really quite an incredible and wonderful thing to see. So in terms of the last sort of thing, I suppose, really, as we move now from summer into autumn on these open moors, and the importance of some of these open moors really is in terms of fueling depots or refueling depots for a number of migrant birds that pass through the moor. So things like fieldfares here in redwings, we have things like the roans and the hawthorn berry to provide this protein and sugar that is really important to helping fuel the migration of these birds. And this is the time, you know, sadly we might have lost, we're very soon to lose the ring-oos as a breeding bird on Dartmoor, but at least, you know, we're still going to hopefully be able to see them during the autumn time as passage migrants. And it's something we get these wonderful birds from Scandinavia that come through, the sort of scallop looks and beautiful birds. And this is a fantastic ring. This was this year actually in the rain one morning. So just moving on now, just to say, in terms of the studies we've been looking at in terms of the open moor on Dartmoor, we've been trying to translate, if you like, some of the passion in relation to watching birds and studying birds on Dartmoor into a bit of science and a bit of conservation work. And so we've had a couple of projects now, a couple of PhD students working on doing various projects, working actually now with the RSPB and Devon Birds and Dartmoor National Parks Authority and that's a research council, try and better us and develop some data and information to help and support conservation of these ground nesting birds on Dartmoor. And it originally started as serendipity. I just met someone called Mark Lawrence and Mark Penny up on the moor one day, and they were looking for birds' nests. They were doing some ringing for the BTO essentially. And then subsequently we formed a team with people like Dave Scott, and I had a couple of PhD students and John Walters, of course. And we started, and I set up this sort of program. They do a systematic survey of the Venford region, about 2 square kilometres, the nesting birds over March-July period. And we did this collectively, it was done about 4 days a week over that sort of breeding season. We recorded the nest, where they were breeding, the status of them, the success of them, and Mark would actually ring them and return through nest record card scheme the information to the British Trust of Ornithology. So we started to develop sort of database and information in terms of what was breeding there and how successful it was. And actually this, and the PhD students and the other people we've taken up, that they've learned all sorts of great field skills in terms of it, not just introducing the birds, but how to observe birds, basically how to observe their bird behavior. And there are many features you can pick up in relation to breeding birds to tell you or give you a good idea in terms of what is eating, what status is that, just by looking at how the birds behave in and around their nest site. Sort of like a commitment and increasing familiarity. We have this big, deep picture in terms of what's breeding where. In fact, over the years, I think it was 10 years overall, we ran the study, almost 1,800 nests were found basically and studied. And what we've done is, so it's here for the stonechat, we've charted where they breed over the different years, and things like here for the meadow pipit, and here for things like windchat. So we built up this sort of like GIS information tracks where they're nesting and how that then relates to the sort of environment and the habitat they are. So we're trying to better understand what they need and in terms of habitat for breeding and breeding success. So getting an idea of what environments are most successful. Then Sarah's been looking at the data with respect to looking at things like, when do they breed? So you can see for meadow pipits, they have sort of a bimodal distribution. They sort of breed, they have 2 sort of breeding spikes, if you like. For things like the skylark, it's much more protracted. And then for things like the stonechat, they have this really early breeding period, which if it's in good weather, basically, they can be highly successful. But in I think it was 2012, when we had that really wet spring, most of the nests got lost. But stonechats will have 3, even 4 broods, some pairs will have on them. And then we have things like the windchats, which arrive really late because they're coming all the way back from Africa, and they just have a single brood. So Sarah started to build up this picture in terms of when these birds are breeding, as well as how successful they are as well. And that success varies over year, and it can relate to all sorts of things in terms of clearly terms of weather, basically, but also things like predation. We have things like foxes and adders, actually are quite a big predator of some of the ground nesting birds up there. And we started to look and compare and contrast to see how successful these particular species are in terms of breeding compared to sort of wider studies across other regions around the UK and actually across into Europe as well. And actually, for the most part, some of the bird species are in around Venford are doing okay, but not as well as some of the other areas. And a real sad loss in terms of what's happening generally in terms of the UK, but certainly in parts of Dartmoor, is the loss of the windchat as a breeding bird. And the first year that we did the survey, there were 22 breeding pairs basically. And then in 2017, for some reason, we don't really know why, of the 13 broods, only 1 was successful. In the last couple of years, just 1 or 2 pairs have been breeding. So the windchat is one that's showing a very, very significant demise on the moor. So what we're trying to do with the data and information we've got here, really, we know, let's say some positives. So there's healthy breeding populations of some of our declining bird species, again illustrating the importance of Dartmoor as a refuge. We know that maintaining that mosaic of habitats and environments is really important for keeping that sort of species diversity and supporting that rich biodiversity. We're seeing that some bird species, even on the moor, which is relatively protected to other areas, are declining, like windchat. But also we've created this information, this big database now to illustrate when the birds are breeding. So we can start to look in terms of what sort of management practices are happening, like swaying, like burning, how that might impact on when the birds are breeding. So, and likewise for the control of bracken, which is done for protecting things, archaeological sites. So we've got this information which we provided to the Dartmoor Parks Authority in terms of how they might manage some of their landscape management activities to help protect some of the bird species. Well, lastly, I think just to finish off, I'm just going to talk a little bit now, finally, about in terms of and back to the cuckoo, and for a number of reasons. As I say, one, it's a particularly fascinating species, but one I have to say I'm a little bit obsessed about. It's a bird that's undergoing massive decline in England, no question. About 62% decline or so across England, even greater in Devon. In fact, it's still doing pretty well up on in parts of Scotland. And in fact, if you look again in terms of how important Dartmoor is as a refuge for the breeding cuckoo, you just need to look at those two maps on the right-hand side. One shows a map of 30, 40 years ago or so in terms of where cuckoo sightings were and where they were breeding. Now look in terms of the concentrate now, and the bottom right, basically, that's from the Devon Bird Atlas, from Devon Birds. So you can see how important places like Dartmoor and Exmoor are in terms of the cuckoo. And there's all sorts of reasons why it might be declining, all sorts of theories. Its migration route, and of course, lots of tracking studies have been done to provide some evidence of that. Of course, it's a long distance migrant, so it's half its life actually on the wing. They're traveling 7,000 kilometers or so. Interestingly, it has a very diet specialism. It feeds on sort of hairy caterpillars, and a lot of those moth species have gone a massive decline. So in the last 20, 25 years, things like the garden tiger, for example, has gone a 90% decline. So quite a lot, probably. Some may relate to sort of the migration routes, but some relate to things like climate change. But I think our team thinks that some of it relates to resources sort of on the breeding ground, and that's really what we set out to do and study. That's the with Chris Human. We actually tracked a couple of birds from Dartmoor. So what we've been doing in relation to our studies, building on that ground nesting bird, is that actually studying, in this case, the cuckoo, is to try and find out what cuckoos are feeding on Dartmoor when they come back to breed, because they require good significant resource after that long distance migration back. They require lots of food, clearly, to be into breeding condition and to be able to produce the eggs that they do. And each female cuckoo may produce 8. I think the world record is about 16 eggs, basically. So they need to get a lot of resources to produce the eggs. And so what Lowell Mills, one of my PhD students, did in the first instance was to find out what adult birds were feeding on, was to go and collect the feces of the cuckoo. So watch cuckoo on song posts as they drop their poo, you let them fly away, go and collect that feces, and then we do something called DNA metabar coding. Basically, it's just using DNA methods to extract the DNA from that poo and from that feces, and then from that, because of sequence analysis, we can identify all the different species that bird has been feeding on. And we started to build up this nice picture now in terms of what cuckoos are feeding on the moor. And indeed, it does include a number of the moth caterpillars and the moth species, which are well known, but all sorts of other species too. So their diet is a bit more eclectic, perhaps, than some of the field observations have indicated previously. And a really important species for cuckoos, adult cuckoos on Dartmoor, is actually green grasshoppers. So we published that in a journal, Avian Biology. So last slide now. So it's always dangerous, I think, when you give talks like this to finish on a bit of a downer and finish on a depressive note. I think there's enough depressive information around at the moment in terms of the challenges that we've all had not being able to get out through things like the COVID pandemic. Troubles out in Eastern Europe now. We know all the pressures that the environment's on, and in terms of changing climate. We aim in terms of our 25-year environment plan, which the government set out. We're failing on so many of those objectives already. And when you look at things like press release articles and things like The Guardian, only 14% of our rivers even reach Water Framework Directive targets. So even though we have some of the best biomonitoring, best observational people in the world in relation to do records of UK wildlife, we're still not very good at protecting it. And biodiversity needs us now more than ever. It fundamentally underpins how systems work, how the ecology of our system works, and we have to do better in terms of its protection. Absolutely, no question. And in our little way, what we're trying to do, working with the Dartmoor National Parks Authority, is to try to better help them understand in terms of how we can better protect and preserve some of the wildlife on Dartmoor, help them to understand a bit more in terms of how the increase in terms of the footfall, which has happened to things like COVID, for example, and increase constructions which are going, how that might impact on some of these really precious habitats we have on the moor, and also help realize in terms of how we can better value through something called national capital accounting the natural assets that we have on the moor, put a proper price really on what their true value and their true assets are. And I didn't really want to finish on a negative note, so I finished on a rather nice slide. This is not actually Dartmoor. This is up north. This is a couple of long-eared owls in the nest. So thanks very much for listening. I hope you took home a few points of interest from tonight's presentation. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Charles. That's brilliant. You caught me mid-typing question there. I'm going to hand over to John, who I know has been fielding questions from people. And can I say, I didn't remind people beforehand, but if you have questions, if you could digitally message John with your questions, John will collate them and pop on to Charles. But over to John.
Okay, thanks, Simon. Yeah, yes, if you'd like to post your questions on to me, then I can relate them to Charles. The first question I've got, Charles, is why are garden tigers declining?
Oh, again, you know, a really good question, and I don't know. And actually, even you know, some of the best monitoring of Lepidoptera happens at a place called Rothamsted, basically. So they've had these long-term records, basically, and they're trying to look in terms of, you know, associations between declines and change in environment and climate, etc. And we really don't know. To some extent, it probably does relate a little bit to the habitat in terms of change, loss of, you know, sort of scrubby areas. Having said that, the garden tiger is quite eclectic in terms of the caterpillar, in terms of the foodstuffs it will feed on. So that can't really explain it wholly. There is some notion in terms of somewhat wetter springs, and milder winters, which are enabling sort of more of the parasites and more of the fungal problems in relation to some of these caterpillars. But again, that evidence, I would suggest, is not hugely substantive. So there's lots of like circumstantial associations, but actually no one has really pinpointed why, in particular, that species has declined so precipitously.
Right. Okay. What is the effect of wind turbines on migrating birds, and how do they affect them?
Oh, good question. Yeah, and my honest answer is I don't know enough to be able to give a really informed answer on this. I mean, I know there are stats in relation to how many birds, you know, are taken out by wind turbines, and I think and I'm pretty sure it varies hugely depending where you are, and of course it hugely depends in terms of where those wind turbine systems are, whether on particular, you know, active migration routes or not. And there's been some big concerns, I know, in terms of some of the offshore ones in relation to that, in terms of where they're placed, sort of strategic. I think though, and again, I have to say I'm talking a little bit off the top of my head here because I don't know enough on this. I'm pretty sure that sort of information now is pretty firmly embedded into where new sites are going, certainly for the big production or the big construction entities offshore. So that information in terms of, you know, the major migration route of bird is very much in sort of like the plans and the so-called environmental impact assessments. Yeah. But I do know that numbers are killed. I think it's quite difficult also to quantitate in terms of how many birds are killed. I mean, a good friend of mine actually studies the impact of wind turbines on bats, and actually there they have trained dogs that actually go and actually find the bats. And so I think they get some quite good sort of quantitative data there. But how you get really good quantitative data for things like wind turbine systems offshore, I'm not sure, to be honest with you.
Yeah, which is of course vitally important really when sighting. As the number of dogs increasing had an effect on birds, and if so, what should we do about it? I mean, it's interesting, this whole debate about should dogs be kept on leads on Dartmoor and interference with bird nesting.
It's a very good question. It's a very controversial question. And I think, you know, as we all know, I think one thing the pandemic has done is that there have been many more dogs bought. Many people have dogs now. So there are many more dogs out there. And I have to say, in the last 20 years, of largely spending much of my spring and summer in around Venford, I've noticed a huge change in terms of the number of dogs, people walking dogs on the moor. So there's no question in terms of the footfall of dogs is much more. And in terms of, I would still say, unfortunately, despite all the signs that Dartmoor National Park Authority put up to try and sort of like, you know, encourage people to put dogs on, most people don't, unfortunately. Some people are responsible, of course they are, but most don't. And I've often confronted people and asked them to put the dogs on lead. And sometimes they do, but I see them that the next time the dog's off the lead. It's very, very difficult, I think. But in breeding rich areas, I think there has to be some degree of control during the breeding season, because there's no doubt the number of dogs in some of those areas constantly moving across them, or even if they're not predating, even if they're not taking those chicks or eggs, just knocking those birds off the nest all the time. And the problem is, especially in these sort of honeypot areas, when that happens, because there's an increase in corvids, crows around the car parks, they see these birds coming off the nest all the time, and they're much more likely then to find the nest and actually predate the nest. So it's for my mind, certainly I would say for the area that I study, it's one of the biggest issues and problems in relation to ground nesting birds on the moor at the moment.
Yeah, interesting. On the same topic, you obviously and your colleagues are trained to locate ground nesting birds. How do you do that, and how do you do it without disturbing the birds themselves?
It's a really good question, and again, I think, and it's true also, and it's a really good question, I think, in terms about not disturbing birds, because that's very, very true for photography, taking pictures as well, basically. And I think there are a series of sort of like, you know, guidelines which you should operate by. I also think in terms of the more you're in place, the more you understand when you're actually disturbing a bird. There's some obvious features in terms of when you're disturbing a bird, in terms of not just things like alarm calls, but other features in terms of behavior where you know that you're imposed on the bird. And for the most part, these nests are actually found from some distance. I mean, I can tell you, we're actually doing some work now. We're studying breeding merlin up on the northeast moors, up in Northumbria, actually. And there, we actually have to be sometimes half a kilometre away, sometimes even more, to watch the birds go back on the nest. Others, they won't go back on the nest. Even curlews, 200-300 metres, they will not go back on the nest. So for many of these birds, you have to stand way back. So you know some birds are really sensitive around the nest. And actually, that's probably why, to some extent, we've lost things like golden plover from the breeding moor, because they're just so susceptible to disturbance on the nest. But then there are other species which are much more robust in terms that they will tolerate much more sort of human presence, I suppose. I mean, things like long-tailed tits, for example. You could never disturb a long-tailed tit off the nest. You can stand right next to the nest, and sometimes, I mean, my friend John Waters, I remember a couple of years ago, we found a few long-tailed nits, and he was watching just as they were building, and he was actually putting feathers in his hand, and they were taking them out of his hand, basically. So, you know, each bird, each species is somewhat different, really, in terms of its sensitivity and susceptibility. So it's really about knowing, again, the biology, the ecology, the behavior of the birds, really, so you can better empathize in terms of when you know you're imposing and when you're not. But a lot of these birds are found from distance, and things like meadowpipits will not go back to the nest if you're standing around. So we're always under cover, for example, to find those. Yeah, okay. And
do you do this, is there any time of the day that you do it, which is preferable, or is it any time? Yeah, again, a good question. And again, so when birds are incubating, when they've just laid or incubating, that's when they're most susceptible. So we tend to be, pretty careful and cautious, to say the very least there. But so early morning is a good time, because quite often then the male bird will come and feed the female on the nest. So actually in the windchat and the meadowpipits, he'll call the female off the nest. And so you can see where the female comes off the nest. And that tends to happen sort of early morning, and then sometimes sort of like mid to late afternoon. So there's certain times of day when it's optimal for when they're sort of on the eggs. When they're feeding the chicks, of course, then depending on what the size the chicks are, basically they'll be going in and out very, very, very regularly. So depending parts on the stage of the nest is, but honestly, the best time, well, I tend to be up on about 4 o'clock, 4:15 during springtime, basically, and I'm often gone basically by 8 or 9 o'clock. The team stay a lot longer, because actually that's when it's hardly anyone's around, basically, when there's a lot of bird activity, and actually it's just a fantastic time to be on the moor. Good occupation for insomniacs, is it?
For sure.
I've got a question here from Jack's iPad here. Do ground nesting birds with really exposed nests, like for instance the nightjar, have much success, being that they're so vulnerable?
Yeah. Again, a really good question. And I don't know, haven't found too many nightjar nests on Dartmoor, but off the moor and some of the surrounding heathlands, I found a lot, basically. So I'd say a lot, 4 or 5 every season over the last 20 years or something like that. And they have a high success rate, a really high success rate. Now, and it's interesting in terms of, because if you see a nightjar, I mean, nightjars are always sitting on the nest. It's very rarely during the day, unless you disturb them, they'll fly off the nest. And they're so cryptic, they're so wonderfully camouflaged, basically, that it's probably the case that corvids, for the most part, just don't spot them, basically. And even when they are chicks, up to the stage when they're sort of fledged, they nearly always got an adult bird with them, basically. But no, I have to say they're one of the more successful ones. But it's a good question. They are completely open.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
Is the redback shrike breeding successfully on the moor?
It did breed a couple of times on the moor, and it was successful. To my knowledge, it hasn't bred on the moor for the last few years.
Right.
I did actually see one on the moor last year at Venford, a male. I got quite excited. I thought it was the first time ever they'd actually bred at Venford, but it was just passing through. So to my knowledge, they haven't bred on the moor last year, but it is pretty quiet, as most people know. So it is possible they still do breed on the moor, but I don't think so. They have bred on the coast a little bit, but on the moor it's very rare and intermittent. They haven't established themselves back really as a breeding species back on the moor, not consistently yet.
Okay. Do ground nesting birds go back to previously used nests, e.g. from the year before?
And yeah, another really good question. No is the answer, in terms of all the birds actually construct a new nest. And in fact, if they have two broods, they never use the same nest again. And to some extent, of course, because you can imagine all these chicks defecating in the nest, or they become pretty riddled with things like parasites and goodness knows what else. So no, they never use the same nest again. But it's a really good question, because that's why I think we've got so much better to some extent in terms of populating data or finding nests over time, because there are certain areas and environments that the birds like to breed in. So we can almost go to an area and sort of know that a medipit's going to be nesting there. What I don't know is whether it's the same bird coming back, because we haven't done anything like colour ringing, for example, of those birds on Benford at least.
Okay, interesting. I think we've exhausted all the questions. Yeah, thanks, Charles. That's absolutely fascinating.
Okay,
really interesting.
Yeah, Charles, thank you so much for a brilliant talk, and I say I'm in awe of the brilliant photographs that you've got there. I can only imagine the hours you sat there waiting to take them. And you must have a telephoto lenses about as long as your arm. I must say.
Yeah, it's a shit problem.
Which means you carry a lot of weight around the place, so not to be underestimated.
There's some downsides
anyway.
to Simons, for sure.
Anyway, that's a fabulous talk. Thank you so much, and we will put it up on the Wildlife Trust YouTube channel, so that everybody can revisit the photographs and listen to it again, and those who missed a wonderful talk could make sure they didn't miss it. So thank you so much.
Lots of posts with thank yous here, Charles.
All right. Yeah, always a
love
pleasure.
being demonstrated by our members. Well done. So,
always very happy to talk to organisations like yours, basically.
Brilliant.
Great.
Well, to our members, thank you so much. That's our last talk for our winter season, but we will be, of course, putting the talks out on the YouTube site, and they stay there for some time. And within the next few weeks, we'll be putting out some details of our summer activities, which I must say look very exciting. So we very much look forward to seeing you, and for the first time in a year or two, face to face, and able to get out there and get a look at things together. So thank you for all coming, and we'll see you again soon.
Enjoy the summer, folks.
Cheers then. Bye.